country like India, whose civilization goes back to the dawn of time, it must be the venue of major cultural festivals which encompass all aspects of creative expression.
Who have infrastructure, who can give you who will do the intellectual part of it.
The Delhi International Arts Festival 2011 brings you the arts of the world from the 31st of October until the 15th of November. The Delhi International Arts Festival welcomes you and is very happy to be part of the HarperCollins book launch. And I now invite Karthikeya, who is the chief editor and publisher of HarperCollins India, to kindly come on stage and take the place.
So right at the beginning of the evening, we thought if Rajiv could and talk to us a little bit about the book itself, and then we have the formal release and a panel discussion, which then opens out in Q&A, in which I hope you will all participate really actively, because I know from knowing Rajiv for a few months that he's going to say a lot of things that are going to be very provocative, that are going to make you want to argue many things with him, and perhaps also go away feeling, well, maybe, just maybe, he got it right, actually. And he's somebody who's saying things to you that you may not have heard before. I know that when I first met him, it was an instant connect to the fact that here was someone who spent a lot of time thinking and reading and writing subjects that a lot of us don't pay enough attention to. And in that sense, it's really appropriate also that we have someone like the Pawan Verma here, who is currently the ambassador to Bhutan, who is himself a writer with books like Being Indian and Becoming Indian, in a way tie in with what Rajiv is doing, which is to talk about being different and questioning ideas of identity and nationalism constantly in order to go further every day in our exploration of ourselves. After he has presented and the formal release, we will have the very distinguished writer, Mr. Sharad Kumar, who will be part of the panel discussion here, and Madhu Khannaji, who is part of the Center of Religious Studies at Jamia University.
Well, let me begin by warmly congratulating Rajiv Malhotra for what I would call a courageous work. I think the process of corrosive questioning of certain legacies which continue to overshadow us even today needs to be done. Needs to be done not as xenophobia, not as chauvinism, but in a reasoned, researched, calm, contemplative counter. The problem today in many discourses is that you have views, but they don't become chiseled points of view because not enough thought has gone behind. So we are proverbially an argumentative nation, but very often it's a lot of surface noise, whereas actually our civilization is known for maulik soch, the power of thought, the power of deep, still, concentrated energy of thought. And that must come back again, because a certain process has happened. Rajiv's book represents the questioning of a certain process which is part of history. And that process began when colonialism began. This is not about the acrimony of history. We are not going back to retell history, but we must acknowledge the consequences of history in order to understand ourselves better today. The project of colonialism is not about the physical subjugation of people. the primary purpose of the project of colonialism is the colonization of your mind. The rulers need to make a case for their rule by which they must prove the superiority of their civilization and the relative or absolute inferiority of yours. It's a process and it starts. This is not speculative history. If you look at the phases of colonization, there was a first phase which I call the honeymoon phase, where there was a somewhat more benevolent discovery of Indian culture. When the Asia Society was set up and people discovered the Sanskrit classics, etc. But it was very soon overtaken by a new evangelism which was convinced about the superiority of Western civilization and its corollary that therefore they were ordained to rule an inherently inferior civilization. But the interesting thing is that this institutional and organized bias was internalized by the ruled. Unless you understand that, it doesn't work. The ruled, the natives, were not only given this message, but over a period of time, through an institutional process, they actually internalized this bias. And therefore, this robust assertion of superiority on one part and this lack of opposition from the other created an asymmetry which is the foundational basis of Western universities, where a certain paradigm is asserted and the other party has been so trained, not so physically subjugated, but has been so mentally trained to accept it. As once Ghalib said, बात पर वहाँ जुबान कटती है, वो कहें और सुना करे कोई. They speak and we listen. So that kind of syndrome became important, and Rajiv has given many very good examples. You don't have to necessarily agree with his point of view on all of them, but they are very good examples of the areas in which that difference exists and is valid. Let me give you a simple example of, for instance, Lord Krishna. Now, in the Hindu worldview, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. It's an exceptionally pragmatic worldview. And Vatsyayan in the Kama Sutra says, in the first chapter, that each of the first three pursued in proportion and none in exclusion leads automatically to the fourth, which is moksha. Dharma, Artha, Kama. Each in proportion, none in exclusion. But which also then gives philosophical validity to the pursuit of desire within the overall ambit of an enlightened life. And therefore, Krishna's Shringar Roop has a place in the overall Hindu worldview. It reflects that. After all, if you think about it, when he left Vrindavan, after all his rather enjoyable frolics with the gopis, the Ras, and went just a few kilometers away to Mathura, he never returned. The gopis were bereft, and he was a few kilometers away, but he never returned. Each pursued in proportion and none in exclusion, but they have a validity. But to the British critique of Krishna in his Shringar Roop, as they have written, I can literally dozens upon dozens of sightings where they say that this is a cesspool of immorality. It's incomprehensible to an outside gaze. And therefore, when the Hindu revivalist movements took place at the turn of the 20th century, the attempt was to reinterpret our own culture and civilization in categories that would win Western approbation, Western approval. And so Krishna's Shringar Roop was jettisoned or glossed over, and you had Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, far more projected. I'm giving you a random example. I mean, even Bankim Chand Chatterjee, a great revivalist, nationalist, said that this Geet Govind, this lyrical, beautiful Jayadev's Geet Govind, is really lacking all manly virtues. But that was not the point of the Geet. So, I mean, in that sense, you internalize the critique. And the other side of the coin is that with this colonial legacy, which if not questioned, continues to linger far beyond political independence. The conventional mythology is that the Union Jack goes up, the tricolour comes up, and a phase ends. But its cultural consequences, which are being challenged in his book, continue much longer. So one is the colonial legacy, and the other is the new challenge posed by globalization. The challenge posed by globalization in the field of culture is summed up in one word: co-option. Co-option means that essentially you say the world has shrunk into a small village. We are all like each other. And therefore, it would be valid, but for two reasons. It's not a level playing field. Some civilizations have greater wherewithal in order to project their culture. And if you are not vigilant, or if you do not develop sufficiently your questioning ability, the chances of your being the deer and someone else being the tiger is very high. And especially ancient civilizations, therefore, need to be vigilant, because some of the themes that Rajiv has taken up, I mean, without a doubt, they reflect certain eternal verities which have not been given their due place in the attempt to accommodate them in some larger Western paradigm. And not enough questioning has gone into it. Because the eclectic frame of mind of, for instance, I'm talking now of Indian/Hindu only because I'm talking of a certain period of history. You can negate everything in order to assert the other. When Shankaracharya says, na me raga dvesh, na me mohalo, madho naiva me naiva matsarya bhava, na dharmo, na chartho, na kamo, na moksha, kuch bhi nahi. Whatever was asserted does not exist. What exists? Chidananda Rupa, Shivoham Shiva. Bliss awareness. So in the assertion of one, there is the complete negation of the other. And of course, we are all familiar. Ekam Satya, Vipraha Bahuda Vedanti. There is one truth, so many people say. So there is an eclectic frame of mind, and there's one issue. Professor Nandi is sitting here, morality. The subjectivity and relativism on morality in our thought needs to be understood. You know, when Duryodhan died, the heavens rained down flowers on him. Bada Veer Yodha. Even Sita in the Ramayana, Kaikeyi in the Ramayana, is not guilty. Because according to the Ramayana, she was temporarily taken over as a result of the gods. Saraswati took over a mind in order to ensure that Ram goes on exile in order that he kills the demons. There is no ultimate fault ascribed to anyone. Everything has a certain relativism to it. And there is no absolute ego also. I mean, in one of the lines Radha sings, when Krishna is philandering with other women, which in a conventional sense is philandering, she says, Chalo Sakhi, Sautan ke ghar jaiye. Chalo Sakhi, Sautan ke ghar jaiye, maan ghate to kya ghat jaiye. Pritam adaras ho jaiye. It doesn't matter, not simplicity, ego simpliciter, arrogance of spirit. Where is our arrogance of spirit today? Where is that Maulik Soch? Where is that question? For which you were known, for which you were in a sense the compass of the world. We need to go back to that. And I think Rajiv's book is a very significant attempt in that direction. Thank you.
Now the book, being different, as I see it, identifies India as a unique civilization. It offers a redressal or a corrective to the historical misunderstanding about India by the West, which we have uncritically digested, assimilated in deep structures of our psyche. In a thoughtful, thought-provoking exposition, the author identifies a set of conceptual blind spots and areas of cognitive dissonance between the dharmic traditions in the East and the monolithic religions of the West. His approach, as I see it, is to distinguish between different layers of ideological frames and foundational principles of Indic dharma that have given the Indic civilization its unique pluralistic identity. Now, what is presented in the book then is what I may call as a diagnosis of difference. And when I read through the chapters, for me the book is really not about universalism, but using the idea of universalism as a lens to heighten the difference between the East and the West. How the East defines itself, how the West tends to negate those interpretations by framing their discourses in terms of the history-centric Judeo-Christian faith. In outlining the essential differences between East and West, as it were, of course, as he himself explained, he reverses the gaze, where the observed takes the position of the observer. He addresses several philosophical categories that define Indic identity. In attempting a critical hermeneutics of discernment, cultural differences is thematized in 5 self-contained chapters, and he did explain those very well. Now I think that in order to understand why there is difference between the East and the West, we have to look deeply into the nature of Hindu faith. And I think if we understand the very nature of what we call Indic civilization and Hinduism, we will be able to decode the differences. Now, in contrast to the Bible, which is the main scripture of the Judeo-Christian faith, the Rig Veda, which is regarded as a legacy of the whole Indic civilization, is looked upon as a foundational text of Indic culture. The Veda is said to be apurusheya, which is what it means is that it is not an artifact, a literary artifact written by a person. It was revealed to the sages or rishis who saw the truth in their contemplation. And Yasaka gives a wonderful, in his lexicon, gives a wonderful description of rishis. Who is a rishi? Rishi is mantradishtaha. That means those who see the mantras, those who have an intuitive perception to absorb revealed knowledge. So Vedic revelation is not a voice of a human revealer. It is regarded as a shruti, that which is heard and orally transmitted. Orality for the Hindu traditions preserves the certitude of meaning. In Western view, orality is opposed to the certitude of words, because it is the sacred book which is the final source of authority. So I think this is the crux, this is one of the major differences between the Eastern view and the Western view. Now, secondly, the Hindu tradition, while presenting several parallels to other great religions, cannot be compared. And that has so much to do with its history as it is the way it is conceived. It is not a religion of one book, but a process, a way of life, where competing claims have found an honorable place. It is often acknowledged that nothing can be asserted about Hinduism that cannot be denied. In practical terms, it means two counter-ideologies may exist side by side, and the two ideologies may coalesce to create a third ideology. Hindu faith works its way intrinsically through decentralized structures, its distinguishing feature is that its widely divergent form of religiosity exists in innumerable combinations within its vast social fabric. So, and this has been in some form or the other approved, defended, prescribed, and standardized by the often conflicting or contesting sources of authority. It has been acknowledged that Hindu faith cannot be regarded as a variant of Western religion. And I think that is what Rajiv is telling us again and again in the book. You know, what he does is to look at several mainstream concepts, and he gets back to the original that, look, we have an indigenous viewpoint and we should preserve that. Because it is woven in the very structure of Hindu thinking. Hindu thinking is different from the monotheistic religion of Semitic traditions. While Hinduism does not fit into the frame of Western idiom, some aspects of Hinduism, however, are expansive enough to assimilate several contrasting forms of knowledge systems. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this idea, because the idea of difference and diversity is, as I said, is in the DNA of our civilization. And our sages and our rishis and our thinkers had to cope with that difference and distinction. So I think that is why you have the most incredible verses in Yajurveda and later on in Atharvaveda that speak about tolerance and that speak about having a respectful attitude towards foreigners, or for that matter for anybody. And you have this famous verse from the Yajurveda which says Mitrasya Chakshusha Samikshamahe, which is that let us look upon everybody as a friend, because it is this bewildering diversity and difference that in one sense creates certain forms of religiosity in India. For instance, what I call them as zones of reconciliation. Pilgrimage, institution of pilgrimage being one of them. That's a zone of reconciliation where all castes and all differences melt. And of course, Rajiv spoke about Kumbh Mela. And then there are also other forms of, collective forms of religiosity like Kirtan, Katha, observing religious performances. This is another zone of reconciliation, as I see, where differences melt. And I think this is an important thing, because this then some kind of idea of unity, I mean maybe at a very abstract sense, emerges from this. Now in this book, the author clarifies the sources and ramifications of misperceptions in 5 chapters, and I don't want to dwell on those chapters because they've been very well discussed. I just want to reaffirm certain ideas which I think are crucial. The first idea is notion of dharma. And I want to go back to Manu, what Manu says about dharma. Now Manu in his Manu Smriti in chapter 2 talks about sources of dharma. And he says that there are 4 sources of dharma. You have Shruti, which is the Vedas. You have Smriti. You have Sadachar. Sadachar is the conduct of the virtuous. Then you have Shishtachar. Shishtachar is the conduct of the learned. And then he says, to my surprise, he says, if you don't believe in the dharma which is propounded by these four different groups, then Swasya Priyam Atmana, very simple resolution, whatever is dear to you. So I think this shows that dharma and many concepts in India it's an elastic term. And then when we follow the term and how it evolved in, let's say, in the Mahabharata, where and in the Bhagavad Gita was a great synthesis. It's an echo of several voices all sort of knitted together beautifully, where dharma becomes, there's notion of swadharma and there's notion of different streams of religiosity come together. So, and in the Mahabharata, it's very well stated in one of the passages that if there's a conflict, how do you know which is the best dharma to follow? And the answer is Desh, Kal and Patra. Again, it's relative to your location, spatial location, to the time when the question is posed, and Patra. It depends who's asking the question. So as Pavan Verma ji also spoke about the relativity of dharma. So relativity of dharma, and I think it's this relativity which is totally different. I mean, it's different in essence, I think, when we look at the Western model. So out of this, now another concept which I think is extremely important is the notion of kosha, that how is the self composed. So you have, for instance, this is an idea that goes back to the Upanishads, and where you have the kosha means 5 sheets, the self is composed of 5 sheets. We have the Annamaya kosh, which is the material sheet. Then you have the Pranmaya, the body of energy. Then you have Manomaya, that's cognitive body. And then that's Gyanmaya or Manomaya. And then you have Vigyanmaya. Now what does Vigyanmaya mean? It means that it's a level of consciousness where you apprehend truth intuitively. So Gyan and Vigyan, are 2 ways of knowing. And then of course finally you have, after that you have the body of bliss, Anandmaya. So what it actually means in operational terms, at any given moment, we can interact with the world on 5 different levels of consciousness. If you look at things materially, you'll get one answer. If you look at it energy, another, then mind, another, and then body of bliss is where there's total fusion and there's a tremendous experience of unity. So in India, we have these amazing concepts where you have notion of consciousness is discussed. Again, the notion of consciousness, like the notion of dharma, is also elastic. You go on stretching it. And in fact, India has more words in Sanskrit on consciousness than any other culture of the world. So you have Paramatma and Samved, and you just take, create a dictionary of it. You'll run into several volumes, with different shades of meaning, tints and shades of meaning. So the idea of diversity is there at every level. Now, my aim was really not to, comment on the chapters in a detailed way. I just wanted to bring these 2-3 ideas together as affirmations. Now, the idea of integral unity is also indisputable, and from Veda down to the Agamas, you have innumerable concepts and images in Hindu tradition that speak about the notion of micro and macro correspondences and unities, and Vedas, as he rightly writes in his book, this notion of bandhutva, then the world being the body of God, and this is, it's just taken over, and there are hundreds of images. That is indisputable. Now the chapter on order and chaos, the author shows that apparently separate worlds or categories of bipolar oppositions are complementary and go together in the Indic worldview, and which is also something which is quite unique. Because, for instance, if we take the notion of male and female principles in the Agamas, the word which describes their sambandha, it's not just a sambandha that 2 things are asymmetrically related. But we hardly look at it in terms of our own persona, in that sense, because the idea of the self in India is linked with these mainstream concepts. So why is Rajiv into this discourse? Why is he putting all these differences together? Yeah, so I think it's really to remind us what you have just said, politics of knowledge. That's what I got for the book. So the images of Indic universalism appropriated by the West have a severe socio-political consequences. It is a necessary precondition for the justification and legitimization of hegemony of cultures of the West. Here the receiving subject, which is us, is portrayed as a mirror image or a near identical to the colonizer of knowledge. Inevitably, the observed subject is one who is pushed to be degraded and devalued. This tilts the power balance on the side of the opponent and establishes unconditional cultural hegemony of the West over the Eastern cultures. Now, I don't think I can go into the socio-political implications of this, why it is happening, but it is happening, and those of us who are perceptive can easily abide with this whole view. So what does he suggest? This is another Sanskrit term, sarpeksha. He suggests a direct mutual engagement with expectation of reciprocity and mutual respect. So basically, he's returning back to the principle of tolerance, which is referred to in the Yajurveda, and other texts. So you're really returning back to something which is perennial and which is in one sense is context-free value. I'm just going to end here. So basically, I found the work, it's a catalytic style, deeply provocative, that should be widely appreciated, and of course, strongly contested. Thank you very much.